Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the European Conservatives podcast, Brussels and Beyond, a podcast designed to keep you in the loop about the political wheelings and dealings that are happening in Brussels and in the capitals of Europe. My name is Zoltán Kottas. This week's main attraction was the National Conservatism conference held in Brussels, which attracted a lot of attentions for all the wrong reasons. The conference was a get-together of national conservative leaders, politicians and academics, including Prime Minister of Hungary Viktor Orbán, former Prime Minister of Poland Mateusz Morawiecki, former UKIP and Brexit party leader Nigel Farage, former UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman, and former French presidential candidate Eric Zemmour. While the planning of the event had been in the works for many months and was made public long ago, the venue in Brussels, Concert Noble, decided to cancel it just days before the start of the event after political pressure from the left-wing mayor of Brussels. Radical anti-fascist groups were demanding the venue cancel the event and threatening protests in front of the building if the conference went forward. A new venue, the Sofitel Hotel in Brussels, also cancelled after pressure from another mayor. The event finally began at a third venue, but was stormed by police who threatened to shut it down on the orders of yet another local mayor. Attendees of the conference who left the building were not allowed to come back, while newcomers were not let in by police. As Frank Furedi, the executive director of MCC Brussels, the event's co-organizer, said, and I quote, "The city of Brussels is occupied by forces hostile to free speech and democracy. Tragically and shamefully, it has become apparent that the political establishment in Brussels is actively collaborating with left-wing extremists to prevent the free expression of political ideas and opinions in the city." The NatCon conference was finally allowed to proceed on day 2, but only after the ban was overturned late on Tuesday after a legal challenge by the event's organizers. The actions of the mayors in Brussels was condemned even by the Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, who said banning political meetings is unconstitutional. The failed attempt at shutting down the conference gained attention all over Europe. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, said, "What is happening in Brussels leaves us in disbelief and dismay." Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said, "The communists couldn't ban us, and neither could the Brussels bureaucrats." Nigel Farage said the whole world can now see the Brussels elite for what they really are, bullying and anti-democratic. No alternative opinion is allowed. This is the updated new form of communism. The European Conservative was one of the co-sponsors of the event, and Zsófia Tóth Bíró, head of our Brussels office, was one of the speakers at the event. Zsófi, can you describe how the police intervention took place? How did the attendees of the conference react?
It came as a complete shock. I was preparing to go on stage and deliver my remarks when I was informed that the Belgian police is at the entrance, not to protect, but to shut us down. So, yes, it was truly insane.
The Belgian mayors who tried to ban the event cited the possibility of public disorder as a way to shut down the conference. But the event was absolutely peaceful. Police intervention was clearly not necessary. Was this a left-wing political maneuver to shut down free speech and alternative opinions?
Just to give you the context for the outrageous political maneuvering of the Brussels mayor, let me tell you how we ended up in Claridge, the third venue of NatCon in the first place. So we'd been in negotiations with Concert Noble for more than 4 months. We thought everything is going well, but about 2 weeks before our event, Concert Noble went completely silent. We knew that they were under massive political and media pressure from the left-wing powers of Brussels. Even Antifa threatened with a protest with the aim of convincing Concert Noble that giving a home for our event is just simply not worth it. Concert Noble reached out to the Brussels police and the mayor asking for proper police protection, but despite several attempts, the mayor would have only given us 2 unarmed police officers to protect the participants and the staffers of Concert Noble. We've received verbal, yes, only verbal. It's a pity. It would have been better if it's put in writing. So we received verbal confirmation that the mayor's decision was purely political and had no other reason for not to give us the protection that was needed. And by that time, Constantinople was gone. They cancelled. 3 days before the conference, we managed to secure a second venue, Sofitel, that just the day before the conference cancelled due to conflict of interests. It was a shock to realize that even such a commercial facility would bow to the will of Brussels' liberal forces. So we as in the Edmund Burke Foundation, MCC Brussels, and the European Conservative, however, did not give up and managed to secure a third venue, Claridge. And that's where things get even more exciting, with the mayor trying to use police to shut our very peaceful event down. They would not let anyone in or out. There was a time when we ran out of water and food, and there was no way to leave the venue or to let the catering suppliers in. So yes, that moment was a little scary. And yes, the mayor indeed cited the possibility of public disorder as a way to shut down the conference. It was just truly insane. We had 15 minutes to respond to the order given by the mayor before the police forcefully enters the venue and escorts everyone out. Thank God it did not happen, because ADF International and its lawyers, one of which was a speaker at the event, intervened and challenged the mayor's decision by filing an extreme urgency procedure. It is a procedure whereby, if all conditions are met, you can receive a decision from a judge in a very short period of time. The court hearing took place, I think, around 10 p.m. the same day, and the judge had decided that there were sufficient grounds of illegalities in the mayor's decision and that the decision has to be suspended. So justice was served, and we were able to continue the conference.
Could the events of the last few days impact the European elections?
Absolutely. In fact, it would be a major mistake from any conservative party in the European Parliament not to use this incident in their electoral campaign so close to the European elections. What happened in Brussels just perfectly encapsulates what MEPs within the ECR and ID groups have been saying for years. So if anyone had any doubts about why this EU election matters in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and the undemocratic nature of the dominant leftist forces of Brussels, well, here is your proof.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and former Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki lambasted the European Union's Migration and Asylum Pact for not resolving the migration crisis, instead reaffirming the open borders policy of the EU. The Conservative politicians were speaking at a press conference in the European Parliament on Tuesday. The Migration and Asylum Pact was recently adopted by the left Liberal majority of the European Parliament and has been harshly criticized by conservative and right-wing forces in Europe. The most controversial part of the pact is the mandatory solidarity mechanism, a tool forcing countries to choose between accepting migrants or paying hefty sums into a common fund. Viktor Orbán said the migration crisis will not be resolved if migrants are allowed to stay in Europe until their asylum claims are examined. Hungary's Prime Minister said the pact should only be approved by unanimous voting, not a qualified majority voting, otherwise it will not work and its implementation will be paralyzed. Mateusz Morawiecki said the migration pact could be a dynamite that explodes in the middle of Europe. Though Hungary, Slovakia and Poland are said to reject the pact, they lack sufficient votes to sink the deal on their own. Parliamentary elections were held on Wednesday in Croatia, and while the centre-right ruling Croatian Democratic Union won its fourth parliamentary elections in a row, it will likely have to rely on the conservative patriotic homeland movement to form a government. The Democratic Union has dominated Croatian politics since the country gained independence from Yugoslavia in 1991, and its current stint in power dates back to 2016. It took credit for Croatia entering the EU's Schengen area and the Eurozone last year, but the Homeland Movement believes the ruling party and the Prime Minister Andrej Plenković are too close to Brussels and are convinced that so-called European values are in the interests of Croatia. If it joins the governing party in a coalition, the Homeland Movement will want Croatia to move to a more sovereigntist direction. As Stjepo Bartolica, a re-elected member of the parliament, a Homeland Movement politician, told the European Conservative, and I quote, "When you look at foreign policy in the EU, we will be asking for much more sovereigntist policies, which means not following the Brussels line. We are not interested in the green agenda, and we're supporting the farmers' movement. We are not willing to sacrifice Croatia's interests on the altar of Brussels' green agenda, climate ideology, and gender ideology. We're very much opposed to this, and I expect difficult negotiations." The Swedish Parliament on Wednesday passed a highly controversial law that will make it easier for people to change their legal gender and lower the age for doing so from 18 to 16, despite strong criticism from parts of the government coalition. Many Christian Democrat and Sweden Democrat MPs expressed concern that more research on gender dysphoria should be carried out before such a law is approved, and pointed out that other mental health problems are common in people requesting to change genders. Sweden was the first country to make gender transition legal in 1972, but this process could take many years and required careful examination and a doctor's diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The country's new law, which will come into force in July 2025, will simplify this process. A short consultation with a doctor or psychologist and approval by the National Board of Health and Welfare will be enough to change legal gender, with no formal diagnosis of gender dysphoria needing to be made. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson claimed the proposal was balanced and responsible, but Jimmy Åkesson, leader of the Sweden Democrats, criticized the adoption of the law, describing it as deplorable and lacking popular support. A recent poll showed that 59% of Swedes think it is a bad or very bad proposal, while 22% think it is a good one. Iran launched around 300 missiles and attack drones against Israel last Saturday. This was the first direct attack by one of Israel's core enemies, a country which helped to plan Hamas's terrorist massacre of Israeli civilians on October the 7th. The Iranian attack was a response to a suspected Israeli airstrike on the Iranian embassy in Syria a few weeks ago. This killed 13 people, including 2 Iranian generals. Israel reacted on Friday by launching a missile which hit Iran around the central city of Isfahan. Western leaders want to avoid further escalation of the situation and have called for restraint. And I have here with me Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, an expert on religious violence and terrorism, who is a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest. Professor, the missile strikes come at a time when Israel is fighting a war in Gaza, and there is an ongoing civil war in Yemen and Syria. All of these events are part of a broader geopolitical conflict between the main players of the Middle Eastern region. How did we get here?
It's a very long and complex story. Here's the short version of it. Essentially, starting in 1948, there's obviously been a conflict with the Palestinians. It was the Nakba in 1948, with a large number of Palestinians leaving or being expelled. The 1967 war, in Arabic, the Naksa, the inconvenience, if you will, created Israeli control of large pieces of the Middle East and the area around it. Where did it begin? It really began there. The larger picture is, in the Middle East, you have always an overlayer of tradition, of what has always been. In this case, Shia versus Sunni. And in the end, that's really what you saw played out in the reciprocal attacks. Iran, with its Shia allies, and Hamas, bought and paid for Sunnis, were arrayed against Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and a group of Sunni countries who acted to protect Israel. How did it happen? How did it begin? In the immediate sense, an Israeli miscalculation. Without telling the Americans or anyone else, they launched this attack, as you said, in Syria, which is on an embassy, which means it's sovereign territory. So by international law and in the minds of observers, it was an attack on Iran. Iran responded ineffectually, as it turned out. But the one thing out of those 300 missiles, the ones that hit were at an Israeli airbase. Israel's reply was to hit an Iranian airbase. And so that's where we stand now.
But it seems like both Israel and Iran have been cautious with their attacks, so they didn't want to cause too much damage as far as it looks. Are they trying to be cautious?
I'm not sure Iran was trying to be cautious. I think it was more ineffectual than caution. 300 missiles and drones sent to various parts of aimed at various parts of the country is not a cautious response. That it was all picked off and it made Iran look quite bad in international eyes. In some ways may have worsened the situation because now they're humiliated on top of everything. But where we are now, there's a lot of breaks in between Tehran and Tel Aviv. The Americans are doing a lot to try to tamp it down because they fear a general Middle East war. The Western allies, who also picked off quite a number of the missiles, are doing very much the same. So there is a lot of pressure on Israel not to respond too much. And Iran has its own internal problems, as does Israel. It's not in either country's interest to bring this much further.
It's interesting that this is the first attack by Iran, like a direct attack against Israel, because we know that they've been using their proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi movement in Yemen. So what provoked Iran to do this? Because they've had decades of political and geopolitical conflicts with Israel.
It's a very good question. The Iranian thinking is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. I think that if I were to give an analysis from here, it would be a combination of the internal pressures, which are building and building, and if you could distract it towards a demonic enemy like Israel, I think the thinking was it would probably have some benefit. Turned out not to. In fact, quite the opposite. There was graffiti all around Tehran saying, "Israel, please strike," as a way of removing this regime. You're seeing on the social media channels, particularly Telegram, there was a great deal of young Iranian support for Israel. The Iranians have launched on yet another hijab campaign, which is leaking videos everywhere of abuse of women, beating up women, throwing them in vans, and then when they emerge, reporting sexual assault, intimidation, and extreme violence, which is no longer a secret. As soon as they get out, it's telegraphed all around the world, as well as internally. So I think that they felt a pressure building, and if they could find a way to let off some of the steam and demonize an enemy, this would be a very good opportunity. But like their attack, that didn't work either.
There has been news for decades that there could be some sort of internal transformation within Iran. There has always been some talk of people, especially young generations, wanting some sort of change. Do you think that the fact that the internet is open to the whole of the world and people can see what's happening, and Iranian new generations can kind of voice their concerns about what's happening in Iran, can that kind of spark a kind of transformation?
That's the hope of the West. I'm very doubtful. And the reason is this. I was actually in Iran at the time of the revolution by sheer kismet. And I greatly believed in it at the moment. Young guys believe in things. Old guys do not anymore. But what you saw, even in the revolution, is traditional alliances playing out. There's always been a traditional alliance within Iran, and this goes back to the Qajar period. It's very old, where you have a triangle, which is essentially the mullahs, the men of religion, the rural poor, and the traditional merchants, the bazaris. Against them are a rising group of young, Western-educated, Western-influenced youth, largely in the large cities, Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, etc., and a group of Westernized intellectuals, people in the modern business sector that have no real ties to the traditional Bazari class. And they've always clashed. There have been periods in Iranian history where the mullahs have been on the side of the reformers. The constitutional revolution, for example, which was crushed by the West, and it was a democratizing movement. It was the last real democratizing movement in Iran. So what you're seeing now that's so visible to the Western world are these young intellectuals. If you follow their Telegram channels, for example, you find a lot of it's in English. It's not even accessible to most Iranians. Is it radicalizing the youth? Yes, absolutely. But even 10 years ago, it was doing the same, even before all of these channels. And when the pressure got too much, they sent in the Revolutionary Guard to the universities to beat up the students. You're seeing the same now, only in a more organized fashion. So will it make great change? I think you'll find a lot of Western analysts saying yes. I think those who are Iranian specialists would probably say no.
You mentioned Western leaders have called for restraint in terms of Israel and Iran attacking each other. Do you think that's a possibility, restraint, or has something begun? Has it already escalated?
I don't think it has. I think there's still an opportunity for restraint between the two powers. I think what you will see is a ratcheting up of the violence through proxies. The idea that two nuclear powers, and they both are, Israel and Iran, would create a cycle of violence that escalates out of control is in nobody's interests, not the West, and certainly not the region. So no, they'll step back from the brink, and to be honest, they're not even on the brink.
And could these missile attacks, could they have any impact on the war that's happening in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, or is that just something separate that's happening?
No, it's not separate at all because of the Hamas ties to Iran and to Hezbollah. So it encourages them. It encourages them greatly. They need all the encouragement they can get, considering the smoking ruin that is Gaza at this moment. But yeah, they will find it very encouraging. What they can do with it, given the current balance of power, is very questionable. The bigger place to look right now is not Gaza, it's in the West Bank. Israel withdrew a lot of its forces from Gaza already, whatever they're going to do in Rafah. And repositioned them in the West Bank. And there is a rising cycle of violence there. The settlers against the Palestinians, the IDF, the border police, who are the most violent of the Israeli forces, the Shin Bet, the security service. There's a wild imbalance of power, but there are numbers. And there are the questions of the settlements. So if you're looking for a place where there's going to be a real spark that has very little to do with Iran, it's right there.
So we're not going to see the end of the Israel-Hamas war very soon?
No, there's really not. One of the problems when you decapitate a leadership is there's nobody to say stop. And you're seeing a lot of that with Hamas. The attrition rate of leaders and of Hamas cadre has been tremendous. Israel, for its part, has a lot of very strong pressure to go into Rafah. To symbolize the chaos and the poor leadership on all sides. Ben-Gvir, who is the most radical voice in Netanyahu's cabinet, days ago, he said, well, if we don't attack Rafah, no matter what America or the world says, then we're going to pull out of the coalition. Netanyahu falls, and then his future is in the courts, where he's already being tried for corruption. And the International Court seems to be opening a case against Netanyahu for war crimes as well. So he can't afford to lose power. Within 24 hours, he calls a press conference, goes on television, and says, "We've set a date for Rafah." All very nice. He forgot to tell the IDF, who's supposed to carry it out. He forgot to tell the diplomatic corps, who's supposed to try to sell this fiasco one way or the other. And it becomes an issue where he's very much the captive of the most extreme voices. So can they step back? A rational leader would. There's very little to be gained strategically going into Rafah. But he must cling to power. And in the end, that's what defines Israeli policy now, to the chagrin, shame, and disgust of most Israelis across the political spectrum.
Thank you very much, Professor. The Iranian drone and missile attacks on Israel have prompted the European Union to prepare to impose fresh sanctions on Iranian airlines and military companies. The decision was made at a meeting of EU leaders in Brussels on Wednesday. Divisions within the bloc, however, surfaced when it came to the question of sanctioning oil. Germany and Austria are understood to be supportive of oil sanctions and denouncing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terror organization. Other member states advocate what they see as a more pragmatic stance. A growing market in China has prompted an Iranian oil export boom in recent months that severely limits the ability of both the US and EU to apply pressure on Iran. This new market for Iranian oil has contributed to a sense of futility within the EU circles about the value of new sanctions towards Iranian energy imports. The more general European backsliding on support for Israel is only strengthened by this position. And that concludes this episode of Brussels and Beyond. Don't forget to read our magazine, check out our website, subscribe to our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube channels, and watch our monthly TV show, Inside Brussels. Hope you tune in again next week. Have a very good week. Bye-bye.